afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another climate K12 session for students, educators, and the public, a series of the climate school. My name is Nishad Mirza, and I will be facilitating today's session. For those of you unfamiliar with the climate school or joining us for the first time, the Columbia Climate School is a newly established it's a newly established school at Columbia University for a transdisciplinary climate research. The school marshals the university's strengths in basic and applied disciplines and expands its resources to understand climate and its impact on the society, develop and inspire knowledge-based solutions, educate future leaders for just and prosperous societies on a healthy planet. The Climate School is the first new school at Columbia in over 25 years. By incorporating more than 20 different centers and over 700 people who collaborate among many departments at the university, we are better able to connect, amplify, and advance new areas of climate inquiry, research, and impact across Columbia and beyond. What we are hoping to do with this Climate Live K12 session is to introduce you to all our disciplinary work through our scientific experts. This monthly session will run throughout the academic year 2023 to 2024 until June. If you would like any more information, you can visit our website. I'm going to put the link on the chat box right here. You can also email us at learn@climate.columbia.edu. Each week we focus on a certain topic and will be directed towards a certain age range. We will have time for question at the end. Please use the Q&A box down below. And the chat is disabled, so you can only use the Q&A. I will read your question at the end when our speaker finish his session. And today's session is the role of carbon removal and storage in a just energy transition. Carbon removal has been highlighted in IPCC report as a critical pathway to decarbonizing hard-to-abate sectors and in limiting global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050. In this session, you will learn about various carbon removal solutions and policy perspectives. We will also discuss what it will take to scale up this new industry in ensuring a just energy transition. So let's hear from our expert, Sanjeev Menon, a Master in Science student in carbon management at the Fu Foundation School of Engineering at Columbia. The floor is yours, Sanjeev.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Thank you, Nishat and Laurel, for organizing this. And hello, everyone. Can you see my screen? It's good?
Yes, we can see it.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. So I kind of wanted to start today. I'm really glad to be able to talk about, something that's really close and near to my heart, which is the role of carbon removal and storage in a just energy transition. Nishat briefly introduced me, but I'm Sanjeev Menon. I study carbon management here at Columbia University in the Department of Earth and Environmental Engineering. I also work as a graduate research assistant with Professor Shana Kelly in the Kelly Lab, which is also known as Pore Store. And in that lab, I have the privilege of kind of studying how carbon dioxide and water move inside of a rock, right? So kind of thinking once we store this carbon dioxide in potentially rocks, how geochemical as well as transport feedback is accounted for. And so I do that with modeling software and get to kind of study that a little deeper. My journey into this began with my degree in civil engineering at the Cooper Union, which is located a little down south in New York City in the East Village. And I'm very lucky to do a trip most summers bringing students to Iceland to learn a little bit more about carbon capture and storage. We dive a little deeper, right? We try and find elves. It's not always so successful, but when we don't find elves, we do find things that are interesting for carbon capture, things like zeolites, which are a material that we're using in the carbon capture industry and carbon removal industry to be able to successfully sequester carbon dioxide. And so that image that you see on the top is us at the geothermal energy exhibition last year, where we got to kind of do a field trip. And that image below, where I'm holding two types of rock, that was perhaps like a very significant defining moment for me entering this work. So, you know, the bottom rock that we look at, you're seeing is it's a kind of a standard basaltic rock, right? It's a volcanic rock that has a lot of pores. It's got lots of holes. And that's kind of what Iceland is typically made of, because it's a very volcanic island. And the image on top, or the rock on top of that, is what it looks like once carbon dioxide has successfully mineralized inside of the rock. So we've taken something, right, that is in the atmosphere, right? Really dilute carbon dioxide in our atmosphere as air, and kind of transferred it and made it into a solid form, right? As a mineral carbonate. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that process is like over today's conversation as well. And my hope is that by the end of our time together today, in the 20 or so minutes that we have, I'll hopefully have convinced you that carbon removal is a necessary tool in our toolbox of climate change solutions, that science, technology, and policy really have to come together to achieve our goals. And our goals right now is 1 gigaton per year of carbon removed by 2050. When we think of 1 gigaton, to put that in perspective, that's about 1/5 of the United States' annual emissions in 2022. So suffice to say, it's a lot of carbon dioxide that we need to be taking out from the atmosphere. And my other big thing that I hope you take away from this is that each of you have a really big role to play in shaping carbon removal to and through deployment. So for Kickstarters, what is the problem, right? It's very helpful to think about that. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. Perfect. So going back to, so I'll show you the previous slide just so you have 10 seconds to read through what I was talking about. But essentially, carbon removal is important. Science, tech, and policy have to come together, and you have a really big role to play. So what's the problem, right? We know that there is something known as the greenhouse effect, and that's because of greenhouse gases that are in our atmosphere. And those are things like water, right? Carbon dioxide, as well as methane. And typically, you know, these are really important for us because they help us sustain life on Earth. But what happened is, with industrialization and excessive use of fossil fuels, we emit a lot more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And this causes us to really have, you know, more heat trapped on Earth. And that causes a rise in temperatures, which is known as global warming. So how much carbon dioxide do we emit into our atmosphere per year due to human-induced activity? It's about something along the terms of 39 gigatons per year. So the way that we measure this, thanks to a scientist known as Charles David Keeling, is through the Keeling curve. And so this curve shows us how exponentially our carbon dioxide concentrations on Earth has increased. It's gone from something like 310 parts per million in 1960 to about 424.95 parts per million just as of 2 days ago. So just to recap, right? We have increasing carbon dioxide concentrations, and that causes an increase in temperatures, and that's bad for us. So what can we do about it? Well, if we look at this curve, right, which looks at, you know, carbon dioxide mitigation pathways, we can see that we're at this blue point here called right now. It's about 39 gigatons. With our current kind of policies, would stay at that amount. And what we could do, right, and should do really, is to bring it down to net zero. And the way we would do this is by prioritizing, first of all, our reduction techniques, so our mitigation techniques. And these include changing our types of fuels from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources, right? Pursuing zero carbon electricity, pursuing zero carbon transport, pursuing things like carbon capture, as well as building energy efficiency. And so if we look at what, the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, tells us, in order to stay to 1.5 degrees Celsius rise in temperature, we want to be reaching net zero by 2050. And the way we would do that is by going down this curve. And so our conventional mitigation technologies will only bring us up to this point. We still see that there is this blue area, right, which is of emissions, of positive emissions. And these come from what we call hard-to-abate sectors. And so you can think of those as aviation, you can think of that as the cement industry, and you can think of that as agriculture. Things that we still use, right, and we need really to be able to sustain our way of life. And so to compensate for those emissions that we're not able to reduce, we would implement negative emissions technologies. And that's this area in green. And so we see that as our carbon dioxide removal pathways. And so carbon dioxide removal refers to technologies that can remove legacy emissions from our atmosphere. So to put that in context again, carbon removal is taking emissions from that 424.95 parts per million and storing that, either in geological storage inside rocks or utilizing it as well. What is not is carbon capture. And this is an important difference because carbon capture occurs at a point source. Carbon capture is something that we implement at a place like an industrial cement facility or an industrial power plant. And carbon capture is like attaching a scrubber at the top of that flue stack and preventing any emissions from going out into the atmosphere. So it's not taking anything away from our atmosphere per se, but it's preventing CO2 from going out. And that's a key difference. So that's why carbon capture is a mitigation technology and carbon removal is a negative emissions technologies. So you might be thinking then, what are the different types of carbon removal pathways? Well, there are many different ways in which we can take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, this legacy CO2. We kind of categorize them in a variety of ways. You can think of them as natural, technological, or a hybrid. And another way to think about these are to think of them as biological or non-biological. There's a lot going on in this slide with respect to the carbon dioxide removal pathways. So I'm not going to be diving specifically into each one, but I want us to think about a few things. First is the idea that all of these pathways are important and that they're being developed in different stages of development. And so the way that we categorize how they're being developed and to identify them is through something known as the technological readiness level. And this was developed by NASA, and it indicates the maturity level of a technology. Next, when we evaluate a technology, we want to think about a few things when it comes to carbon removal. We want to think about permanence, right? So say we captured this carbon dioxide, how long is it going to be stored in a safe and stable manner? That is tied to the idea of permanence. And that storage duration can really vary differently depending on the type of reservoir. So for example, if you inject carbon dioxide into a geologic formation that's deep underground and it mineralizes into a rock, you know for fairly certainly that it's going to stay there. And so that is effectively permanent, right, for tens of thousands of years. Whereas if carbon is stored in a forest carbon stock, it has the potential of re-releasing this carbon back into the atmosphere due to things such as wildfires or when we harvest for trees. So that's something to think about, is that time scale of storage and how it ties to permanence. Another thing we want to think about is additionality. And this refers to the idea of what additional climate benefit or impact did doing the project yield. So for example, you would be able to compare what it means, what additional benefits you had by having a direct air capture plant as opposed to not having a direct air capture plant. And this becomes really important when evaluating different types of carbon removal pathways. And the last thing that's really important is cost, right? The world revolves around money. We want to make sure that our project is sustainable and also financially sustainable, and that it's able to be eventually be able to run with effective financing mechanisms. So I want to deep dive into the direct air capture and storage facility that we get to visit in Iceland. And this started in 2021 by a company known as Climeworks, and Hellisheidi in Iceland. And it captures about 4,000 tons of CO2 annually, which is the equivalent to about 800 cars. And once this carbon dioxide is captured, it's then stored in the Icelandic underground through the storage partner Carbfix, where it eventually turns into rock through mineralization. So the carbon capture itself happens in 2 steps. So typically what we would have is large amounts of ambient air, right, with the 424 parts per million of CO2 that moves through a DAC system. And this DAC system contains a filter material, which is known as a sorbent. And I like to think of a sorbent sort of as like a Velcro. And so what happens is the carbon dioxide molecules preferentially stick onto this sorbent, and then it kind of holds on to the sorbent, allowing the rest of the air that's CO2 free to pass through. Now, in the second step, that carbon dioxide is released from the filter through the application of heat, and that can then be collected for either further use or to be stored away. And so in this case, the solid sorbent direct air capture process uses a really porous solid sorbent that has a high surface area to be able to absorb CO2 molecules. What we see from this is that direct air capture requires different resources for its captured process. And so, for example, it needs energy to be able to release the CO2 once it's been captured from the filter. And so in the scenario of Climeworks, they use low-grade heat, which is about 100 degrees Celsius. And it's important that that energy comes from renewable energy. And Iceland is fortunate in order to have plenty of geothermal energy that it can use to minimize the great emissions of this technology and maximize the amount of carbon dioxide that's removed. And what's exciting in this field is that Climeworks is also developing its second plant, and that's called Mammoth, and that's going to, massively scale up to about 36,000 tons, and it's currently under construction, and something to think about. So this is just an example of one company, but there are plenty of companies that are rapidly developing and scaling carbon dioxide removal solutions. And so this example specifically looks at just direct air capture as well. But what we learn is, in this case of deployment, right, to reach our 1 gigaton, we must recognize that technology doesn't exist in a vacuum. In order for a wide-scale deployment, we need a couple of things. We need the tech to remove the CO2 to work, right? We need a place to be able to store that carbon dioxide for a long period of time. We want it to be cost-effective. And most importantly, we need this to be supported from across the board by all our stakeholders. Where is it going to be placed? Who are the people that are going to be living beside it? What we've learned also, and as I'm sure from previous climate K12 sessions, is that climate change is fundamentally unjust. The communities that are least responsible for its causes bear, a disproportionate share of its effects. And so carbon removal, it's important that carbon removal doesn't just improve the climate, but also improves the well-being of the community. And with, this new development of an industry of carbon dioxide removal, there's really a real opportunity to revisit the kind of relationship that an industry has with its environment, with a community, right? A relationship that isn't extractive, but rather inclusive. And it's important that we want these projects to scale. And so we want to ensure that there is acceptance across the whole community to be able to reach our 1 gigaton goals. And some of the ways that we can do this is by asking these really important questions, right? How are we incorporating environmental justice considerations? how are we thinking about things like informed consent, mutual respect from the early stages of planning a project. And in order to do this, it requires a bottom-up strategy, as well as a community-driven strategy, which will be critical for developing and deploying equitable carbon removal projects. And this is really where the science, policy, and technology all have to come together to achieve our goals. So I want to leave you with this, and this is an activity that we did in Iceland, and it's something that I come back to pretty often. I'm borrowing this from Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson in her TED Talk on how to find joy in climate action. This is important because working in climate, I find not to be a sprint, but rather a marathon. So you really want to be thinking about three things in this Venn diagram. First, you want to ask, what are you good at, right? Reflect on all the skills, resources, networks that you have. What are the areas of expertise? Maybe it's drawing, maybe it's advocacy, maybe it's communication, maybe it's science and engineering, maybe it's problem solving. Who and what do you have the access to, and what are you able to bring to the table? The next thing you want to think about is what's the work that needs doing? And here you want to be really thinking about, higher level change. Are there sorts of climate and justice solutions that are passionate and near to your heart? Maybe it's, starting an advocacy program at school, or a composting program, or a recycling program, or maybe pushing for a carbon removal bill to your senator. There's tons of options out there, and you get to decide what is most important to you. And the third thing is what brings you joy and satisfaction. And this ties back to what I said earlier, where, it's you have to go for the long run. So what gets you out of bed in the morning, and only pick the things that really excite and energize you. And when doing this, you might find that, you land on something that brings you to the heart of the Venn diagram. And that's where you want to be for as many seconds in your life. And that way we can really create progress on climate solutions and achieve our gigaton goal. So I want to also leave you with a couple of resources that I found personally really helpful to learn more about CDR, carbon removal. One is a great textbook by Holly Jean Buck, which is called the Carbon Removal Primer. There's a great podcast called Carbon Curve. For those interested in policy, there's a lot of work coming out of Carbon 180 and lots of research, as well as an open source platform, which is the Open Air Collective. They do a great weekly session highlighting on Tuesdays at noon, highlighting different companies that are emerging within the carbon removal field and span across the breadth of carbon removal pathways. And it's a great way to kind of get introduced and learn about developments in CDR. With that, I thank you for your time, and I'll open the floor for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjeev, for an amazing presentation. So we do have some question. I'm going to read it to you. So first question is from Nalin. And given the limitation of current carbon removal technologies like direct air capture and ocean carbon sequestration, in terms of scalability, is there a recognized pathway for scaling up significantly to have a meaningful impact on global carbon removal efforts?
So this is a great question. Thank you. So just to clarify, it's around which pathways are kind of clearer than others. Was that the question?
Is there a recognized pathway for scaling up significantly?
Yeah, definitely. So, we are seeing that there is a rapid development in different types of solutions, right? So different types of pathways. And one thing that has really pushed and advanced this solution development is through the IRA, which is a Inflation Reduction Act that was launched by the US government, and lots of funding across the diversity of pathways. But I would say, what we've seen develop so far is direct air capture. We've seen a lot of movement within the direct air capture field. And so going back to, and as well as biochar. So if we looked at that slide, I can pull it up again, of all the different pathways. Biochar and direct air capture are further ahead along the line, I would say, as opposed to the other ones. But that is not to say that, all the other pathways are not being rapidly developed upon as well. We're seeing a lot of emerging technologies, some of which are at the research scale, right? So if you go through the technological readiness levels, it ranks from 1 to 9. And 1 is something that's, at the benchtop inside a university lab. And 9 is, where it's really commercial and fully deployed. And none of our technologies are at a level 9. So it's something, that we have to be mindful of and think about.
Great. The second question is, could you describe the chemical reaction that takes place between the carbon dioxide and absorbent filter?
That's great. So the chemical reaction between carbon dioxide and the absorbent filter. So essentially what's happening is it's a molecular bond that is formed between the carbon dioxide with the sorbent filter. So it's not necessarily a chemical reaction, right? It's just an adsorbent. So it's kind of sticking on to the material.
Thank you so much. And we only have 2 more minutes, so I would like to ask you few more questions. So, okay, so I had one question when I was, listening to your amazing presentation. You said that when you talk about achieving net zero for aviation and agriculture, they are creating a lot of greenhouse gases. So what you would say that what are the steps they are taking to reduce those greenhouse gases?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So as you mentioned, these are hard to abate sectors, right? So with aviation in specific, there is a movement to develop something known as sustainable aviation fuels. And sustainable aviation fuels are technologies that reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that's emitted into the atmosphere from using these fuels. And so there are pathways that are used to create these sustainable aviation fuels. Currently, the one that's like furthest ahead in the process is one known as HEFA, which is hydroprocessed ester and fatty acids. It's a long mnemonic, and that's one pathway. But there's another pathway called power to liquids, and this is where you can use the electrolysis of water and the use of green hydrogen to create a fuel that burns, with very, very little carbon dioxide emissions. As we mentioned, these are, utilization technologies that are really newly being developed. And so we're seeing that at the lab scale, and we're seeing a few startups come up with new technologies, but nothing that has been developed at a really, commercialized scale at this time. Yeah. And so we do see that, there's also policy movements. For example, the Inflation Reduction Act that I mentioned has come up with specific incentives for manufacturers that use sustainable aviation fuels through the 45V credits, I believe. And so you get an incentive to produce these sustainable aviation fuels as well. I also
Thank you
noticed
so
there are
much.
some questions in the chat. It's a great question around how expensive is carbon removal and who currently pays for it. And so, to answer that question, carbon removal is expensive. It ranges anywhere from about $200 to $600 per ton to remove carbon. And this is because of, the novelty that's associated with creating a new technology, with kind of manufacturing really precise parts, as well as developing the sorbents that are being used. So those are being done in the lab. So it is pretty pricey. And the Department of Energy goal is to bring that down to about $100 per ton, by 2030. Yes.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Last question is from Anna. What are the potential future risks that are associated with current carbon storage techniques? Risk from carbon storage techniques.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna. I think you bring up a really important question, which is, around when we inject anything into the subsurface, we want to be really conscious about the kinds of associated impacts it has. And from the carbon storage perspective, one of the first things I would think of is the pressure buildup, right? When you're putting a lot of carbon dioxide, even though it's, compressed, we're causing a buildup of pressure. And so we have to identify what kind of associated impacts it has. One of the things that comes out from this is potentially induced seismicity. So we see that, where carbon dioxide has been injected, we are able to study whether there is an associated impact with seismicity. In some cases, there have been nothing that is so big that causes like an earthquake or such, but it's something to be mindful of. Another thing is, again, around flow, right? So when we are injecting this carbon dioxide into the rock, how does it flow? Where does it go? How does the plume of the carbon dioxide that we've injected migrate, right? Is there a fault? If there's a fault, what is the impact of the fault line on how this carbon dioxide will move? And so these are very much the questions that we at Columbia Engineering get to ask in school and through our research, so that we can make sure we do this safely, and to make sure that, models are a great way to kind of assess safety, so that we can also build reliability in this field as well.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Sanjeev. And thank you everybody who joined, and keep joining our Climate Live program for the next few months. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Have a good day, everyone.